The Second World War was a storm of brutality, ideology, and survival. Official history books tell us of battles, treaties, and atrocities, yet within sealed vaults and faded microfilm, other truths exist. These are stories deemed too volatile for public release, filed away in locked drawers marked with red stamps reading "classified" and "do not circulate." They reveal decisions made in shadows, operations carried out without witness, and crimes erased not by accident, but by deliberate intent. From the sewers of Warsaw to the fortress ruins of Königsberg, from secret laboratories inside Dachau to corridors of negotiation between the OSS and SS, these events remain absent from textbooks. What you are about to hear are fragments pieced together from declassified cables, erased testimonies, and whispers exchanged in Cold War backrooms. The voices of the dead rise through brittle documents, reminding us that war leaves more than ruins. It leaves truths buried so deeply that even victory demanded silence. This is not official history. This is the history we were never meant to know. Chapter 1. Classified Massacre Beneath Warsaw Streets. In late summer of 1944, Warsaw was a city in flames. The Polish resistance, known as the Armia Krajowa, had launched a desperate uprising against German occupation on August 1st, hoping to liberate their capital before the Red Army arrived. For 63 harrowing days, men, women, and children fought street by street, cellar by cellar, with scarce ammunition and dwindling supplies. The world remembers the uprising as a tale of courage crushed by German reprisal, but the surviving archives of the NKVD reveal a darker layer, one absent from the textbooks and memorials. Deep beneath the broken city, in its labyrinth of sewers, something unspeakable unfolded. The Warsaw sewer network had long been a lifeline for the resistance. Narrow, foul tunnels allowed couriers, fighters, and civilians to move unseen, smuggling messages, weapons, and food between isolated districts. Photographs from the time show young scouts guiding fighters by candlelight through waist-deep filth. German forces attempted to flood and gas the tunnels, but never managed to fully eradicate the fighters who used them. What has remained hidden, however, is that another enemy was already waiting inside. Soviet forces, advancing from the east, were ordered to halt their offensive just outside Warsaw. Stalin's armies remained stationed across the Vistula River, silent as the uprising bled. It was in this silence that the NKVD, Stalin's feared secret police, carried out an operation long buried in classified files, Directive Iron Cross. According to fragments of documents discovered in Moscow in the early 1990s, Directive Iron Cross authorized sanitization of Warsaw's subterranean resistance networks. Stalin had no interest in a victorious, independent Polish resistance that could rise against Soviet control after the war. The uprising was politically inconvenient. A Warsaw liberated by its own people would have meant a post-war government unfriendly to Moscow. The NKVD's solution was surgical, ruthless, and entirely deniable. Their reports never reached Allied archives. Their evidence was sealed beneath layers of false attribution, officially blamed on German reprisals. But cables marked with the signature of Lavrenti Beria, Stalin's brutal security chief, tell another story. The method of execution was chosen for efficiency and secrecy. Teams of NKVD operatives, dressed in looted German uniforms, slipped into the tunnels under cover of night. Survivors described the sound of metallic clinking echoing through the sewer walls, followed by hissing gas and the roar of flames. They carried specialized gas grenades similar to those used by the Germans but equipped with Soviet markings, and portable flamethrowers of the ROKS-3 model. The tunnels filled with choking smoke. Resistance fighters trapped in dead ends clawed at the walls in desperation. Some attempted to flee upward into manholes, only to be met by gunfire from unknown soldiers waiting above. Within hours, entire sectors of the underground resistance were suffocated or burned alive. The passages collapsed as explosives sealed the exits, leaving hundreds entombed beneath Warsaw's shattered streets. For decades, the massacre was dismissed as part of the wider German campaign of extermination during the uprising, but inconsistencies nagged at post-war historians. Why were some tunnel sectors destroyed with charges more consistent with Soviet engineering explosives than German ones? Why did German records of sewer clearing operations differ so sharply from survivor testimonies? And why did Allied reports contain abrupt redactions whenever the NKVD's presence was mentioned? The missing pieces surfaced only after the fall of the Soviet Union, when researchers gained limited access to declassified files. Among them was a chilling note, handwritten in the margin of an NKVD report. Resistance neutralized in subterrane. Attribution: Wehrmacht. The human toll of the sewer massacre is difficult to quantify. Estimates suggest hundreds, possibly more than 1,000, were killed in those sealed tunnels. Their bodies, decomposed and buried beneath reconstruction projects after the war, were never formally exhumed. Families searching for missing fighters received no answers. Official casualty lists of the Warsaw Uprising, already staggeringly high, made no distinction for those who vanished underground. They became the forgotten dead, casualties not of German bullets, but of Soviet betrayal. To acknowledge them would have undermined the carefully constructed narrative of Soviet liberation, a myth Stalin's regime propagated relentlessly after the war. Testimonies that did surface were quietly suppressed. In displaced persons camps across Europe, survivors spoke in whispers of men in Soviet uniforms entering the tunnels. Yet these stories were often dismissed as confusion, trauma, or propaganda. Western intelligence agencies, including the CIA, possessed fragments of intercepted Soviet communications referencing the operation. Declassified cables from 1946 show analysts debating whether to release the evidence. They ultimately chose silence, fearing that exposing Soviet atrocities might destabilize fragile post-war alliances and derail negotiations already strained by the emerging Cold War. Thus, the massacre was not only concealed by the Soviets, but also by the West, for reasons of political convenience. The massacre beneath Warsaw was more than a military action. It was a message. By exterminating resistance, fighters in the very arteries of the city they sought to liberate, Stalin ensured that post-war Poland would be too broken, too leaderless, to resist Soviet domination. The Armia Krajowa's command structure was decimated. Survivors who later emerged were often hunted down, imprisoned, or executed in the years that followed. A generation of Polish resistance vanished in silence, their memory buried as effectively as their bodies. Today, fragments of the sewers remain accessible as historical monuments. Tour guides recount the bravery of fighters moving through the dark tunnels, but rarely mention the massacre that took place within. Plaques and memorials omit the role of Soviet betrayal. Schoolbooks teach of German atrocities, but not of NKVD operatives sealing exits with explosives. The silence persists, echoing the sealed passages beneath Warsaw's streets. The victims lie where they fell, beneath layers of concrete and modern construction, their deaths written out of official history. The classified files leave us with haunting questions. How many more directives like Iron Cross were carried out in silence? How many uprisings, resistance movements, or small acts of defiance were deliberately smothered not by the enemy everyone expected, but by an ally turned oppressor? And most importantly, if the truth of Warsaw's underground massacre remained hidden for decades, how many other atrocities still sleep in locked archives waiting to be unearthed? The answer, like the tunnels themselves, may remain forever buried. Chapter 2: Forbidden Experiments. Inside Dachau Shadows. Dachau was the first Nazi concentration camp, established in March 1933, and it became a model for the network of camps that followed. Official records speak of horrific experiments conducted within its barbed wire perimeter, freezing endurance trials, high-altitude decompression chambers, and cruel tests of new pharmaceuticals. These atrocities, catalogued during the Nuremberg doctors' trial of 1946, are well known. Yet within sealed corridors of Dachau, deeper inside a wing never open to journalists or liberators, another program operated in absolute secrecy. Its codename was Project Nachthimmel, the Night Sky Project. Unlike the experiments that sought physical limits, this hidden program was designed to fracture the human mind. The unmarked annex, sometimes referred to in Soviet post-war documents as Block Zeta, had no official blueprint. Survivors who later recalled its existence described corridors painted in dull grey, with soundproof doors and thick wiring embedded into the walls. Windows were bricked over. Within these chambers, SS physicians linked to Heinrich Himmler's Ahnenerbe, the mystical research division of the SS, conducted experiments in sensory manipulation, forced hallucinations, and psychological control. Prisoners brought into Block Zeta were tattooed with numbers beginning with the letter Z. They were not listed on transport manifests, nor did their names appear in Dachau's central registry. In effect, they ceased to exist the moment they entered. The experiments pursued questions that Nazi ideology regarded as vital to its vision of domination. How long could a human mind survive in complete darkness? Could trauma, chemical exposure, and sensory deprivation break resistance more effectively than physical torture? Could a prisoner be stripped not just of will, but of identity itself? Surviving testimony suggests that subjects were confined in sealed pitch-black rooms for days, sometimes weeks. Their only stimuli irregular bursts of high-frequency sound or hallucinogenic injections. Substances resembling mescaline and scopolamine appear repeatedly in fragments of laboratory reports later seized by Allied forces. One note attributed to Dr. Sigmund Rascher chillingly remarks, "Subject exhibits dissociation after 36 hours, self-recognition destroyed, potential military applications promising." What separates Project Nachthimmel from other Dachau experiments is not only its method, but its aftermath. When the camp was liberated by American troops on April 29, 1945, the existence of Block Zeta was barely acknowledged in their reports. Soldiers photographed the main laboratories, the autopsy rooms, the piles of bodies, but descriptions of the annex were either redacted or omitted entirely. A 1946 US Army intelligence document, declassified decades later, contains a single cryptic sentence: "Unexplained facility, located North Wing Dachau, subsequent access denied." Who denied that access and why remains contested. Some historians argue that American forces intentionally concealed what they found, fearing Soviet exploitation. Others believe the experiments were deemed too valuable to destroy. The trail of evidence becomes clearer when viewed through the lens of Operation Paperclip, the secret US program that recruited Nazi scientists for Cold War research. While names like Werner von Braun became famous for rocket development, lesser-known figures with experience in chemical interrogation and psychological warfare were quietly absorbed into American intelligence programs. Files from the CIA's MKUltra project, declassified in the 1970s, contain shocking parallels to Dachau's Block Zeta experiments. Techniques of sensory deprivation, hallucinogen use, and forced trauma bear striking resemblance to procedures described in surviving German reports. One declassified MKUltra memorandum even references earlier continental studies, Dachau, Ref. Nachthimmel, though the context was heavily censored, Soviet archives tell a similar story. In 1946, NKVD operatives seized crates of documents from abandoned SS facilities in Bavaria. Among them, according to a Cold War-era defector, were fragments of Dachau psychological research. The KGB allegedly used these findings to support its own brutal interrogation techniques during the Stalinist purges and later in Lubyanka prison. Thus, the forbidden experiments inside Dachau did not end with the camp's liberation. Their echoes shaped the clandestine battles of the Cold War, weaponizing the human mind as territory to be conquered. Eyewitness accounts are scarce, but they exist. In the 1950s, a Polish refugee in Munich recounted being held in total darkness inside Dachau, hearing only mechanical humming and feeling injections burn into his veins. His story was dismissed at the time as delusion, the product of trauma. Yet decades later, when fragments of Nachthimmel files surfaced, his testimony gained chilling corroboration. Another account comes from a French resistance fighter who described a room lined with copper wiring, where sudden electrical pulses forced him into seizures. He was released weeks later, his body intact, but his memory fractured. He struggled to distinguish reality from hallucination for the rest of his life. Why were these experiments hidden more completely than others? The answer may lie in their direct relevance to post-war intelligence priorities. Unlike hypothermia trials or aviation endurance, which had limited use after 1945, the manipulation of human thought had endless value in espionage, counterintelligence, and warfare. To expose Project Nachthimmel would have raised uncomfortable questions about why both East and West quietly integrated its methods into their own clandestine programs. It was simpler to let Block Zeta disappear, sealed in official silence. Architectural evidence suggests the annex was dismantled in the months following liberation. US engineers reported demolishing several unstable structures within Dachau, though their blueprints show no record of these demolitions. Oral history from nearby residents recalls convoys of trucks removing crates under heavy guard. The crates, many painted with black crosses, were never logged. Rumors suggest some were shipped to American research centers in Fort Detrick, Maryland, or to Soviet laboratories in Novosibirsk. None were ever seen again. The forbidden experiments of Dachau remain absent from museums and textbooks. Visitors walk the campgrounds, hear the stories of gas chambers and forced labor, but the corridors where the human mind was dissected are gone. No memorial marks their location. The victims who wore the Z tattoos are not named in records. They were erased twice, first by the Nazis who sought to strip them of identity, and then by the victors who saw in their suffering a dangerous utility. What lingers are fragments, a coded file reference in MKUltra documents, a survivor's broken recollection, a Soviet defector's whispered confession. Together, they outline a program that stands as one of the war's most disturbing legacies. The war ended, but the experiments continued in basements, interrogation rooms, and research labs on both sides of the Iron Curtain. The shadows of Dachau stretched far beyond 1945, carried forward by those who saw in horror not a crime, but an opportunity. And in those shadows, the line between liberator and oppressor, between science and barbarism, blurred until it disappeared. Chapter 3: Erased Pact between SS and OSS. By the spring of 1945, Germany was collapsing into rubble. Berlin smoldered, the Reich crumbled, and Hitler's generals were defecting or preparing their final stands. Official history recounts the unconditional surrender signed in May. But hidden behind that public act of defeat were secret negotiations, quiet meetings in Alpine villas, and coded transmissions between enemies. At the center of these shadows lies a forgotten bargain, one that Allied leaders would never admit, and one the Nazi SS ensured remained buried. It was not a surrender of ideology, it was a transaction. The files that describe it bear the codename Emerald Transmission, and they reveal a pact between the OSS, America's wartime intelligence service, and select divisions of the SS who sought not absolution, but survival. The most visible trace of these dealings is Operation Sunrise, the documented surrender of German forces in northern Italy, negotiated between OSS Chief Alan Dulles and SS General Karl Wolff. But the official record stops there. The sanitized version suggests a noble attempt to shorten the war and save lives. Yet intercepted radio messages from Bern, Switzerland tell of wider discussions. Redacted memoranda reference entire technical divisions, offered in exchange for safe passage. These divisions were not ordinary soldiers. They were the scientists, engineers, and intelligence officers tied to the Reich's most secret projects. Rocket propulsion, nerve gas formulas, and underground weapons research were bargaining chips placed on the table by men with blood on their hands. Karl Wolff emerges as the central figure in these hidden talks. An SS general and close aide to Himmler, Wolff knew the Third Reich was doomed. His personal correspondence, later discovered in German archives, shows his desperation to preserve his rank and his life. In March 1945, he traveled secretly through the Alps to meet OSS intermediaries in neutral Switzerland. Present at these meetings, according to fragments of OSS files, were Swiss intelligence officials and representatives of the Vatican who had already begun managing rat lines, escape routes for Nazis into South America. Behind closed doors, Wolff offered a chilling proposition. In exchange for sparing his men and ensuring their post-war protection, he would deliver scientific research, intelligence files on the Soviets, and names of collaborators across occupied Europe. The Americans listened. Dulles, ever pragmatic, saw the looming Cold War more clearly than most of his peers. With Soviet armies sweeping through Eastern Europe, access to German research and experienced personnel could determine the balance of post-war power. Rocket programs like the V2, developed under Werner von Braun at Peenemünde, promised to reshape warfare. Nerve agents like Taben and Sarin, tested ruthlessly on prisoners in occupied territories, offered terrifying possibilities. The Americans were not alone in seeking this knowledge. Soviet intelligence, through the NKVD, conducted parallel negotiations with fleeing SS officers, ensuring that the secrets of the Reich would not vanish but be split between the future superpowers. Evidence of the erased pact surfaces most clearly in the fate of these men. Officially, many SS scientists and officers were listed as captured, tried, or killed. In reality, dozens disappeared from records only to reappear years later in unlikely places. Argentina, Chile, and Brazil became havens for mid-ranking officers, ferried by networks managed through Rome. Meanwhile, in the United States, names like von Braun, Hubertus Strughold, and Kurt Blome emerged in sanitized dossiers. They had been deeply involved in the Nazi war machine, yet their pasts were scrubbed as they took roles in American rocketry, medicine, and defense research. Strughold, implicated in freezing experiments, became celebrated as the father of space medicine. Blome, tied to chemical warfare trials, later consulted for US projects studying germ warfare. The Pact went beyond science. Intercepted Soviet reports suggest the OSS obtained intelligence on underground Nazi financial networks, including assets moved through Swiss banks and Vatican accounts. These funds, hidden in neutral territories, were critical in establishing post-war escape routes. Some of the same capital that financed the SS later supported businesses and political movements in South America, allowing remnants of Nazi ideology to survive long after 1945. Allied investigators who tried to trace these funds often met stone walls. Key banking files disappeared. Witnesses recanted under pressure. The money trail went dark, not by chance, but by design. The moral cost of these negotiations was staggering. While the world was told of justice at Nuremberg, where high-ranking Nazis were paraded and condemned, dozens of others simply vanished into new identities. Their crimes, from chemical extermination to mass executions, were erased in exchange for their knowledge. Declassified CIA memoranda from the early 1950s show bureaucrats wrestling with the optics of employing such men. Operational utility outweighs prosecution, one line reads. It was not justice that prevailed, but expedience. The victors chose silence, constructing a narrative of moral clarity while secretly absorbing the Reich's architects into their own institutions. The Pact's erasure was deliberate. In the 1970s, when congressional committees began probing CIA activities, hints of these transfers surfaced. Files on Operation Paperclip were declassified in part, but references to Emerald Transmission remained heavily blacked out. Even today, historians attempting to reconstruct the scope of the OSS-SS negotiations face blank pages and missing archives. The Germans destroyed much themselves as Berlin fell, but the Allies helped complete the erasure. To admit the deal was to tarnish the moral high ground of the war's end. To expose it was to risk undermining public trust in the post-war order. Yet the truth persists in fragments. Survivor testimonies from concentration camps mention scientists disappearing before liberation. Vatican archives contain sealed files marked with the initials of SS officers later confirmed to have escaped. Argentine immigration documents list German arrivals under suspiciously falsified names in 1946 and 1947. Many of them men tied to technical divisions of the Reich. When pieced together, these shards reveal the outline of the erased pact. Not a surrender to justice, but a bargain with survival. What remains most disturbing is not merely that such negotiations occurred, but that they succeeded. The legacy of the erased pact lives in Cold War technologies, in South American communities where Nazi fugitives lived openly, and in the uncomfortable fact that modern science and intelligence bear the fingerprints of men once branded as war criminals. The war may have ended, but through clandestine bargains, its perpetrators ensured that their knowledge and their silence lived on. The story of 1945 is not one of absolute victory, but of compromise, betrayal, and the erasure of justice in the name of power. Chapter 4: Hidden Soviet Atrocity at Königsberg Fortress. April 1945. East Prussia had become a cauldron of desperation. The fortress city of Königsberg, once a proud Prussian capital, was reduced to rubble under relentless Soviet bombardment. The Red Army encircled the city, determined to crush one of the last German strongholds. Official history records a brutal battle, followed by the city's surrender on April 9th to Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky's forces. Yet beneath the official narrative of victory, declassified GRU files and scattered testimonies reveal something more sinister. A massacre carried out not against enemy combatants, but against civilians and captives hidden within Königsberg's underground fortress. It was an atrocity erased by deliberate silence, concealed under the triumph of Soviet arms. The fortress itself was a sprawling network of subterranean bunkers, tunnels, and strongholds, originally constructed in the 19th century and expanded by the Wehrmacht as the war turned against Germany. As Soviet shells rained down, thousands of civilians, women, children, the elderly, fled into these underground shelters alongside officers' families and Baltic forced laborers. The Wehrmacht stored valuable plans there too: blueprints of fortifications, secret weapons depots, and communication codes. When the Red Army finally broke into Königsberg, they discovered these chambers not as empty ruins, but as vaults of both people and information. According to dispatches later classified under Operation Sealing, Soviet commanders faced a choice: liberate the survivors or eliminate a potential intelligence risk. The order, allegedly approved under Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky, was to silence the fortress completely. The method was ruthless. Survivors described Soviet soldiers herding civilians into central chambers under the guise of relocation, then barring the doors. Gunfire echoed in the tunnels, followed by explosions that collapsed entrances. Witnesses spoke of muffled screams trapped behind walls of rubble. The Red Army labeled the act sanitation, claiming it was necessary to prevent counterattacks or German sabotage from within the fortress. But declassified reports used chillingly vague language. No further traces of occupants. Chambers neutralized. Intelligence analysts later concluded that the executions served a dual purpose: eliminating witnesses to Soviet behavior during the conquest and erasing sensitive German military documents without the risk of leaks. After the war, Königsberg was renamed Kaliningrad, absorbed into Soviet territory, and sealed to foreign researchers for decades. The fortress ruins were rebuilt or covered with post-war housing projects. Any attempt to investigate was denied on grounds of security. Families searching for missing loved ones were told they had perished in battle, their bodies supposedly destroyed in shelling. Yet inconsistencies persisted. Civilian lists showed entire neighborhoods unaccounted for. Soviet casualty reports contained unexplained gaps. And captured German officers testified privately about hearing explosions inside the fortress after surrender had already been declared. These fragments pointed to a massacre carefully hidden behind the veil of victory. Western intelligence agencies were aware. Intercepted Soviet transmissions from April 1945 refer cryptically to sealed sites and disposal complete. A British intelligence summary from 1946, declassified only in fragments, noted, "Evidence suggests mass civilian liquidation within Königsberg's stronghold. Release not advised." The reasons were strategic. The Allies needed Soviet cooperation in occupying Germany, dividing Europe, and finalizing post-war borders. To expose Soviet atrocities would have jeopardized already fragile relations. Thus, the truth was buried, sacrificed to the politics of the Cold War before it had even begun. The human cost remains incalculable. Estimates suggest that thousands may have been trapped in the fortress during its final days. Some were likely executed outright, others entombed as explosives collapsed tunnels. Local folklore speaks of ghostly cries beneath the streets of modern Kaliningrad, where new buildings stand atop what were once subterranean chambers. In the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, limited excavations uncovered bone fragments and rusted German weapons deep beneath residential areas. Russian authorities quickly halted the digs, citing public safety, and sealed the sites once again. The remains were never formally identified. Why was this atrocity hidden so thoroughly? The answer lies not only in Soviet brutality, but in post-war necessity. The Soviet Union sought to present itself as a liberator, not an occupier. Massacres against civilians, especially after a surrender, would have shattered that image. Meanwhile, the West preferred silence, unwilling to fracture the alliance narrative in the early years of reconstruction. Thus, the massacre at Königsberg became a casualty not only of war, but of politics. The victims disappeared twice. First, into the darkness of the fortress, then into the silence of erased memory. The atrocity also foreshadowed the brutal tactics that would characterize Soviet control over Eastern Europe. Secret purges, forced disappearances, and falsified records became instruments of domination. Königsberg was the beginning, a prototype of silence imposed by force. Its memory survives only in whispers, displaced families recalling loved ones who entered the fortress and never returned, intercepted cables that historians were never meant to read, fragments of tunnels where the air still smells of burnt stone. The fortress stands today, partially crumbled, partially restored, yet its most terrible secret lies beneath, sealed by both concrete and denial. The massacre at Königsberg forces us to confront a harsh truth. Even in victory, atrocities can be hidden, erased, and forgotten. The victors write history, but sometimes they also bury it. In the silence beneath Kaliningrad's streets lies a reminder that war does not end with surrender. It ends with the stories that are told, or in this case, with those deliberately left untold. The war's most terrible secrets rarely end with the clash of armies. They linger in sealed files, redacted reports, and whispered testimonies that never reach the courts of Nuremberg or the pages of history books. The Warsaw tunnels, the hidden chambers of Dachau, the erased pact between the SS and OSS, and the silent massacre at Königsberg all reveal a truth more disturbing than battles or borders. They show us how atrocities can be buried by both victors and vanquished, erased not by time, but by deliberate choice. Each silence served a purpose: to protect political alliances, to exploit forbidden knowledge, or to preserve the myth of moral clarity in a war where every side made compromises. These events remind us that history is not only written, it is edited, redacted, and sometimes destroyed. The questions they leave behind remain urgent. How many more sealed files sleep in archives, waiting for the day when someone dares to unearth them? How many stories of the Second World War remain unspeakable, not because they are lost, but because revealing them would still be too dangerous? The answers lie waiting, locked in shadows,